Hello, my name is Nathan Smith, and I'm here to talk about the Lenni-Lenape mythology found in the Red Record, also referred to as the Wallum Olum. The Lenni-Lenape means original people or the true people. And from what I can tell, within the religion of naturalism, you have people trying to state what mythology is. And I don't believe they have a real answer for that. I think the Bible gives us or helps us with that answer. For instance, Joseph Campbell, sometimes you'll see him on PBS. He wrote that ancient myths were merely subjective metaphors or perhaps expressions of the subconscious mind. I disagree with that. I think, however, after I read a book by Robert Bowie Johnson having to do with Greek mythology, I believe that Lenape mythology, Greek mythology, Sumerian mythology, Egyptian mythology, all of them go back to early Genesis and help us understand that early Genesis is actually correct. We'll go over some world cultures. We'll talk about the early Red Record. We'll talk about Constantine Rafinesque. Constantine Rafinesque is the one who translated the Red Record. We'll talk about the early Red Record, also known as the Wallum Olum, first two books. We'll go over the overview of the last three books of the Red Record. We'll talk about some new supportive DNA evidence that Nathaniel Jeanson has come up with. I'll be using the Red Record, which is a publication by David McCutcheon, for part of this lecture. We'll talk about the controversy of the Wallum Olum brought about by a Mr. Ostraker. And we'll go over a couple of artifacts, and we'll wrap it all up at the end. In the history of Genesis, from chapter 1 up to chapter 11, we find the early history of the universe. Now, that history is true, I believe. And after the Tower of Babel, of course, people scattered throughout the world. And at that point, different people groups, which later became nations, passed down early Genesis by word of mouth. The Sumerians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, other people from around the world, and the Lenni-Lenape. The Lenape, also called the Delaware, they remember the Creator. They remember the original world. They remember that the Creator made the heavenly bodies, made men and women, and they remember Noah, who saved the animals through the flood. Now, it's an interesting comment that Mr. Ostraker, who is a critic of the Wallum Olum and what Constantine Rafinesque did, he was kind of critical of the idea that ancient man deified, or very ancient men were deified by later humans. And yet, when we look at Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, and Sumerian mythology, that is exactly what they did. If you would like, you can also check out my other lectures that I did on these different mythologies at our website at NJBibleScience. It's interesting because the Sumerians actually did a pretty nice job of remembering the cherubim. Once you understand what's going on, you see how they did a nice job remembering, quote unquote, the cherubim. The Greeks, they remember early Genesis. However, the Greeks ended up becoming atheists. So everything in Greek mythology is sort of flipped over from the history of the Bible. If it's good in the Bible, it's bad in Greek mythology. If it's bad in the Bible, it's good in Greek mythology. The Egyptians remember the pre-flood patriarchs, the pre-flood kings. The Sumerians do as well. They have the Sumerian kings list, so they remember as well. But the Egyptians remember Adam and Eve, they remember the God of creation, and they remember Noah and his family and the flood. On the other hand, down through history, from God to Adam to Noah to Shem, they all wrote down their experiences in their own history, and that history was passed down in written form, probably on scrolls, and those documents or copies of those documents were later provided to Moses. So when Moses took those documents, put them in order, being led by the Holy Spirit, he wrote early Genesis using those documents. So none of early Genesis came down to Moses by word of mouth. It was always written down. And the Sumerians, in their artwork, they show us that Noah, when he went through the flood, he brought a library or documents with him, scrolls with him. So if we look at the world and we look at the different mythologies that come to us throughout the world, we can see the Chinese character over there in China. That is an ancient Chinese character, and it's the character for boat. And it combines the symbol for a vessel, persons, and eight. So a large ship is made up of a vessel with 8 people on it. And what is that? That's a reference to Noah's Ark. Over here in China, there is a place called Sangshangdui. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correct. And some interesting archaeological findings were found there, which I'll mention a bit later. The Ottawans, they remember Noah's flood. The Hawaiians remember Noah. They call him Nu'u. The Welsh, which is on my family lineage, they remember Noah's flood as well. The Choctaw do. There are over 270 flood stories from around the world. There are other stories as well about God the Creator, but this is a prolific story in ancient mythologies from around the world, and they all make sense from a biblical history point of view. The red record, the original red record on the sticks that it came on, I believe is a world treasure. It is a very important document that the world has. It is, I believe, an historical document. It provides insight to man, and it also includes the later history of the Lenape. I believe it should be taught in our schools along with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's how important this document is, I believe. Constantine Rafinesque, he is the one who obtained the Wallum Olum from Dr. Ward and was the first to translate it. He's kind of an eccentric guy, but he is self-taught, and he taught himself Greek and Latin. And when I went to the Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, I saw this poster on the wall there in the museum. And here you have Rafinesque's big-eared bats that he named. He found them, he studied them, and he named them after himself. Eventually, he became the professor of botany at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. Here is what the Wallum Olum would have originally looked like: a series of 22 sticks with pictograms on them. I'll go over the first 2 books fairly closely, but the 3 through 5, I'll just provide an overview of them. What had happened is Dr. Ward, in the 1820s, he had healed the family of an Olumpi. An Olumpi is a record keeper. In order to give him something for his help, he gave him the most expensive gift that he had, and that was these sticks. This is the history of his people. The most treasured things that he had were these sticks of their history. Here we see over on the left, we've got the pictograms. The pictograms that they've provided, they drew on the sticks. You have the original words there in the middle column. And then to the right, you have the translation. And what do we see here? Right at the beginning, we see that there was sea everywhere and the sea covered the earth. It's very similar to what we read in the Bible. In Genesis verses 1 and 2, we see the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters that covered the entire world. Here you have in the second verse there, you have the introduction of Ketanatuit, who is the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit is primordial. In verse 3 there, primordial, everlasting, invisible, omnipresent. And again, the Great Spirit moved to create. Of course, we read in Genesis, verse 1 and 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's very similar, and Christians believe the same thing about our God, that he's primordial, he's everlasting, he's invisible, he's omnipresent. It goes on to talk about the Great Spirit creating the sky, the earth, the clouds, the heavens. He brought forth day and night, which means he brought forth the sun and the moon and the stars. And what do we have? God creating light. And God created the stars as well. And in Genesis 1:14, he says, and let them serve as signs to mark his times and days and years. And of course, in their verse 6, in the red record, it says these were all brought forth to move in harmony, just like the Bible says, to provide sacred times, days, and years in verse 14 there. And just as in the Bible, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place and let the dry ground appear, as in verse 6 there in Genesis. In their verse 8, it says, as pure as snow arose the lands to be inhabited. Again, it says the Great Spirit moved, Ketanatuit. This time he created spirits, living beings, immortals. This is not the same as what we read in the Bible, but remember, the red record was passed down by word of mouth at first, before it was put onto these pictograms. But they were living beings, they were souls. He created souls for everything. The grandfather of men down in verse 11, the first mother in verse 12, the fish, the turtles, the beasts, and the birds, they were all created. But then the bad spirits came along, and they brought forth bad creatures like the snakes, the sea monsters. Similarly, in the Bible, it talks negatively about the serpent. In Genesis 3, 1 through 24, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord had made. Negatively, in the red record, the bad spirit brought forth flies and mosquitoes. No one likes them. But going back up again, you got the grandfather, you have the first mother of life. God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God. He created them, male and female. He created them, which is Genesis 1:27. Here we go back to a point in time in the red record, in their history. It says friends were all living things with each other. So it was a friendly place. There was a benefactor, helpful spirits. Then it says the ancestors, the first men, they were alone, and the women were brought to them. Again, very similar to the Bible. God brought Eve to Adam. But also in Genesis 1:31, it says God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. This is very similar to what they're saying here. Here in verse 19 of the red record in book 1, they were hungry for food, and these ancestors gathered it. And in verse 20 there in the red record in book 1, all were delighted, all were carefree, all were happy. Again, very similar to what the Bible has said. But the Bible said up here in Genesis 1:31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So you have this similarity going on, which makes sense, because the red record, even though it was passed down by word of mouth, is a remembrance, or an attempted remembrance, of early Genesis. But then again, just like in the Bible, very secretly there in verse 21 of the red record, At the end, an evil snake, a sorcerer, came to the earth. Wickedness and wrongful criminal acts came. Black weather came. And down at the bottom here, this was long ago in the land beyond the great flood. In the first world, there was that wickedness. Again, in Genesis 3:1, now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And what did he say to the woman? Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Here he is tempting Eve. In their remembrance, in the mighty time of the serpent, were men and evil beings. The mighty serpent was an enemy to those ancestors there, who soon grew to hate it. So this is after the Garden of Eden, but this is before the flood. They fought, they did wrong, which reminds us of when Cain attacked his brother Abel, right? They had no peace according to the red record. Homes were destroyed by murderers and bloodshed, just like in Genesis 4:23. Lamech said, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. Here he went overboard in his justice, if you will. Later on, just as in the Bible, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of man, of the human race, had become on the earth, and that every inclination of his thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. In the same way, in verse 7 of book 2, flooding and filling, smashing and drowning came the flood. In Genesis 6:7-8, I will wipe out from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And guess what? The Lenape remember Noah. Here in verse 8 of the Red Record, book 2, at Turtle Island was Nanabush. That is Noah. And you can see his pictogram there on the left. Noah riding, or Nanabush riding, the turtle. He's also called the Great Hare. He's the grandfather of life. And of course, he's our grandfather. Noah is our grandfather as well. We know this from the Bible. And they remembered that. So steadily creeping, Noah and the turtle went to the rescue. Other people were tried to save themselves. Some of them were eaten, as they say there in verse 11 of the book 2. But then the spirit daughter came along and helped with a boat. You can see the pictogram there of the spirit daughter and the boat. And it reminds us directly of Genesis 6:14. So make yourself an ark of gopher wood. That's what Noah did. And of course, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. Nanabush, going back to the Red Record, verse 13 there. Nanabush, grandfather of all, ancient grandfather, turtle grandfather. One of the clans of the Lenape is the turtle clan. The people there were united. They were frightened, but they prayed, and the turtle saved and restored the world. There you have the world being saved by way of the boat and by way of Nanabush. And of course, at the end, in verse 16, at the end of book 2, the great flood dried, the valleys and the hollows, and the great peril was over. It was over. It reminds us very much of Genesis chapter 6, verses 7-8, when God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wives and your sons and their wives, and bring forth the animals so you can repopulate the earth. So that ends book 2. But before we go on to the overview of 3-5, I just want to mention a very interesting artifact that was found in Sanxingdui in China. It is a bronze tree, and it has a serpent there on the right-hand side. In that right figure here, that right picture here, you can see the serpent. You can see the hand to the right there, and you can see the branches of the tree. You can see birds on top of the branches. That is a reference, I believe, to the Edenic nature of where this tree stands. But you also see this, which is very telling. You see the fruit there in that bottom picture here. And next to the fruit, there's leaves, but those leaves are knives. So what is the message here? The message here is you can take from the fruit of this tree, but you will feel pain if you do. And that reminds us directly of what's in the Bible, having to do with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here we have an overview of books 3 through 5 and the travels of the people, the Lenape people. You can see them starting over there in Central Asia. They head north, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. And then they head east. They keep heading east, generally speaking, and they end up going across the Bering Sea there on the ice. They keep heading east through what's now Alaska. They come down, and sometimes they split up, sometimes they come back together again, and eventually they go through sort of the northern part of the United States, continually heading east, until they make it to New Jersey. Now here is a representation of what the one ice age would look like, at least at some point in the ice age. Now, this would be a little bit later in the ice age, but earlier in the ice age, you would have warm seas, and thereby the top there, the north part of Siberia, the north part of Asia there, modern-day Russian, that area would have been a warmer climate, even though more southerly you might have more snow, because the air would be, or the moisture from the seas would be carried to the south and deposit snow in the south. But along the coast with warm seas, it would still be free of ice in that part. So it's interesting how in book 3, verse 3, it talks about how the Lenape went north in order to reach greener pastures, to follow the game, the deer, the elk, and so forth, to follow them to greener pastures, which would have been closer to the coast in that period of time of the Ice Age. So it's very interesting. And the critic, Mr. Ostraker, misses this fact because, he doesn't believe that the book of Genesis is true. So he doesn't believe in the one flood and the warm seas that caused the Ice Age. Now, it's interesting, when I last did a lecture about the Lenape and the Red Record, I didn't know about this information that Nathaniel Jeanson has discovered and has cataloged and explained. By the way, you can watch his videos on YouTube, Answers in Genesis, Nathaniel Jeanson. They're very interesting. But his work, I believe, helps us confirm what's written in the Red Record, that history that's written in the Red Record. Nathaniel Jeanson, he estimated the lengths of certain times within the history of the Red Record. He estimated them using the rule of the sachems. Hopefully I'm saying that right, sachems. And he did those calculations, he made those estimates, and from the Red Record, he believed that the arrival to America, this would be to Alaska, that would have occurred somewhere between the 300 to 600 AD. That would be their arrival into America. And then there would have also have been conflicts for about 500 years after their arrival, or sometime after their arrival. The question is, well, who were they in conflict with? Well, we know from archaeology, we know from other stories from other peoples, other natives, that there were other people here before Native Americans got here. Some of them built mounds. Some of them built the medicine wheels we see out in the West. Some of them built America's Stonehenge, which is up in the Northeast. There are stories from other Native Americans where they talk about giants. The Navajo talked about the giants, the Choctaw, the Comanches, the Manta, and the Paiutes all had interactions with the giants. So they were here before the Native Americans got here, before the Lenape got here. Here we have a reconstruction of the Amerindian population. It's based on a book by Carmen, or a study by Carmen. It takes the Y chromosome lineages, plots them on a graph of the population. This is the alpha root position. There's also an epsilon root position, which extends a little bit further to the left, down to around the 400s for the point on the graph where the Amerindians came into the Americas. This is the alpha position. There's also a gamma position, which is a little bit more to the right, but the same general characteristics of the plot is shown in either case. The epsilon comes in a little bit earlier. Here's the alpha one, which is the center one, which I'm showing you here, and then the gamma is a little bit more to the right. But once it hits that plateau, the graph is the same for each of those three root positions. But here you can see some confirmation of the calculations that Nathaniel Jeanson made when it came to the Lenape coming into the Americas of the early AD time period. You can see how this graph shows a confirmation of the calculation that Nathaniel Jeanson made having to do with the Lenape arriving in the Americas in the early AD time frame. He calculated 300 to 600. The other root position would be quite consistent with that. But he also calculated about 500 years of conflict. And of course, you can see that conflict here in the flat portion of this graph. So I believe that this is, in fact, a confirmation of that. Up here on the upper right, you see black lines having to do with actual historical documents and that estimates of the Lenape based on historical documents. You have the purple line there, 1492. That's when Columbus came to America. Here is shown the distribution of haplogroup Q. There's another haplogroup, group C. Theirs isn't as populated as haplogroup Q is. So I'm just going to use haplogroup Q here. It is thought that haplogroup Q includes the Lenape. But this distribution is consistent with the red record, starting in ultimately the Middle East, going to Central Asia, and then heading further and further east, coming into the Americas through the Bering Sea. This information is consistent with the red record, and it's inconsistent with Ostrecker's critique of the red record. Ostrecker, in his criticism of the red record, he says that loan words that are in the red record is evidence of a fraud. Well, the Lenape in their history, not only in the red record, but other oral traditions, they used to have interaction with other tribes like the Ojibwe, the Shawnee, the Sioux, and the Iroquois. So it would make sense that they would have borrowed words from those tribes in their language. Remember, the Lenape language is not a written language.
Using modern Lenape definitions to translate old Lenape words does not make sense, just as modern English definitions for words does not equal old definitions for English words. What is true is that Old Norse and the Old Lenape have similar definitions for words. Therefore, it is correct for Rafinesque to use the Old Norse definitions to translate the Old Lenape words and not use modern translations of Lenape words.
Now, there are several people who believe that the Red Record is legitimate. Now, that doesn't prove that it's legitimate, but it's good to know, I think. Nathaniel Jeanson, myself, a guy by the name of Bruce Malone, who has, by the way, a couple of lectures on YouTube about the Red Record, a guy named Westlager. He's a historian from the 1800s, and a guy by the name of George Hyde. And then, of course, you have David McCutcheon, who wrote the book, The Red Record. When people from Europe began to arrive into the Americas, this is where the Lenape people lived. This was their distribution. It was in New Jersey, as you can see, partly in New York, partly in eastern Pennsylvania, a little bit there in Delaware. Later, they were forced to leave. You can see when they were forced to leave. Some ended up in Oklahoma, some in Wisconsin, some in Canada. Some of them became Christians, some of the Lenape. Today in New Jersey, it is thought that there are about 3,000 Lenape citizens in New Jersey. Now, of course, this would be what I would call full or very close to being full Lenape, not smaller percentages. Here you have the seals of the Lenape, from the one from New Jersey and then the one from Anadarko, Oklahoma. The New Jersey seal shows the Turtle Clan, and it shows the 4 colors representing the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. The Oklahoma seal shows the fire drill, which was used to start a fire in order to start a meeting. A lot of times they would have meetings around fires, so that's what that represents. Some of them became Christians, so you see their cross there. You have prayer sticks around the outside, and you have 3 clans here: the turkey, the turtle, and the wolf clan. The Masingwe face, that is in the center of the seal and is the keeper of the game animals on which the Lenape depended for food. If you go down to South New Jersey, to Bridgeton, New Jersey, you can go to the library there, and you can see their arrowheads made of flint, quartz, jasper, rhyolite, agrolite, to make arrowheads, spear points, knives. You can see their pottery there in the bottom. Some of their pottery had designs on them, maybe thought to be of a particular family. In other words, each family might have had their own design. They're not sure about that. But here's some more pottery. There's a little cup used to mix ceremonial paint, and apparently they found a trilobite inside. Kind of interesting. There's another museum in Greenwich, New Jersey, which is about 10 minutes away from Bridgeton. You can see larger clay pots there. They would put grain in there and they would bury them under the ground to store them. You can see the plates that they made. You can see the arrow there at the top. Speaking of arrows, the Lenape also used the atlatl as well as a bow and arrow. And here's a young man demonstrating how it would work. The atlatl is a throwing stick to help you throw the spear with greater force and accuracy. Here, I just wanted to show some of the place names in New Jersey. Hoboken, Navesink is that picture there in the wintertime. The Navesink I mentioned, the Picatinny, Rumsden, several place names are Lenape place names. Well, anyway, I just got to say that I believe that the Lenape did remember early Genesis, and they remember their history, and it's pretty amazing. And this understanding that the red record is true fits right in with other mythologies from around the world, and in my opinion confirms that it is a true document of history. I believe that Rafinesque's translation was vindicated by the DNA analysis that Nathaniel Jeanson has done, and it's pretty interesting. It's pretty exciting, I think. And I know Nathaniel Jeanson will continue to do his DNA analysis as more DNA information gets provided to him. But they remembered the Lenape. They remembered God the Creator. They remembered Noah's flood. They remembered early man, and that women were brought to men. They remembered the serpent. They remembered that the serpent brought bad things. They remembered that the early world was a good world and a peaceful world. And in the end, it shows once again that early Genesis is true history, and that it can be trusted. And my hope is that you also trust the early history of Genesis. I hope that you trust the whole Bible, and I hope that you also have Jesus in your heart as Lord and Savior. Thank you.